So I'm just back from church now and wanted to set down a little summary of the sermon and some reflections on that. It's an interesting process preparing a sermon, doing your research on your thinking on that, and then actually preaching it. It always feels a little bit different. Some parts feel more important than you might have expected, others less so. And then, of course, there's the process after church of people commenting and wanting to discuss what's been said, which also just changes the perspective. So the sermon was on 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and really what I was saying was I was struck by how, although Paul is clearly writing to a particular context in the town of Corinth and things that were happening there, the underlying message of that is strikingly relevant for the very different world we live in and the very different issues. And the issue underlying all of that is the question of freedom. The Corinthian Christians, influenced by Greek philosophy, had this sense that as long as they kept their souls pure for Christ, then what they do with their physical bodies really didn't matter terribly much. And so they were using that perceived freedom in ways which Paul has concerns about. The most blunt example being telling them they shouldn't be using the services of prostitutes, which might seem a fairly obvious thing for us to say to a Christian congregation. But in that context, clearly he felt that needed to be said. So here we are today, living in a world in which press freedom, how we use our freedom of expression, is a very big issue. This past week we've seen demonstrations both for and against the publication Charlie Hebdo and the things they were publishing and the offence that was caused there. And it's interesting as we find ourselves in the midst of this debate about how free should we be to express things even if it offends others. We come to this ancient text in which that very issue of how we use freedom and whether it's freedom to do whatever we want, no matter the consequences or not, is one that's read in our churches and talked about. But the example which Paul uses specifically is how we use our freedom in terms of the physical sexual desires that we feel. Because clearly the people in Corinth felt free to do whatever they wanted, that was of no consequence to their spirituality, their faith, their souls. And here we are living in this world which Paul could not possibly have envisaged, where the word he used, porneia, is our word for pornography, sexual immorality. It's translated in the Bible, or fornication in the older translations. And I was saying we might struggle to agree on what sexual immorality means today, but with this very clear example of pornography available at the click of a mouse or the touch of a screen, seemingly quite disembodied, seemingly having nothing to do with our lives or our relationships, seemingly harmless and victimless and anonymous. So we wonder, if we are free to do that whenever we want, what difference does it make? Does it affect us? And in that context, we read these very ancient words of Paul, written to a quite different culture, but saying the message that's strikingly relevant, that when we try to separate out one part of our human lives, our sexual desire in this case, when we try to imagine that's disconnected from the rest of our human lives, then we are, in a sense, dehumanizing ourselves, making ourselves less than fully human. So Paul did not come in, even in that context in Corinth, with a sort of thou shalt not, just say no kind of approach to what he saw going on in that town, but a much more positive kind of message. Yes, Jesus Christ sets us free from the need to worry too much about rules and regulations. Our faith in him is what matters, but we can't then imagine that because we trust in Christ, what we do with our bodies, how we express our sexual desires, doesn't matter at all, because it's all part of who we are. It's all part of how we live our life and who we become. And the call of the gospel is always to completeness, to wholeness, to become fully human. And the example we have of that is the life of Jesus Christ, living humanity to the full. So, words written for a very different time and place and a very different set of issues have these very powerful resonances for us today. What does it mean to use the freedom which we have? And technology has given us kinds of freedom that Paul and his original readers couldn't possibly have imagined. Yet still, the gospel message is reiterated. We're free, and it's wonderful that we're free, but we're called to use that freedom in a positive way, towards a positive purpose, rather than just using that freedom to go off in whatever direction we want and imagine it doesn't matter at all because it's our right to do that. Translating what Paul was wanting to say into a clear and defined ethic for today is, of course, not at all simple. I'm sure the people back in Corinth read it and wondered exactly what it meant in this example or that example, but the principle is vitally true. It's wonderful that we're free. All of our life is intended to glorify God, and we ought to be using all of our freedom in that purpose to be fully human, to be generous and giving and life affirming in the way that Jesus was. I hope the message this morning has provided food for thought and plenty to reflect on.